Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Lawton. I'm Special Projects Editorial Director for SC Media and your host for today's webcast. Welcome to Let's Look Back at the Attacks of 2018, the worst vulnerabilities and breaches, and what lies ahead. Today's webcast is sponsored by Capsulate. 2020 webcasts are a production of the SC Media Editorial Department. You can think of this as a fireside chat with a subject matter expert on a topic of interest to security professionals. This is not a product pitch. With that said, let's move on. Please join me in welcoming to our studios Brandon Edwards, the co-founder and chief scientist at Capsulate. Brandon's responsible for cybersecurity research strategy. Prior to launching this company, he was the VP of Threat Labs at BAE Systems, having joined the company through its acquisition of Silver Sky, where he designed that company's cloud-based zero-day prevention product. Brandon also has served as the hacker in residence at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering and held senior security roles at Tipping Point and McAfee. There will be a Q&A following the presentation, so we do encourage you to type in any questions you might have for Brandon via the interface. Welcome, Brandon. Let's get started here.
Thank you very much.
This year kicked off with full-on security meltdown when, indeed, Meltdown Inspector hit the scene. Sorry about that. It's too easy of a pun. It was all downhill from there this year. Saks and Panera, now Facebook again. Today's webcast, we'll look at some of the worst breaches of the year, but also look at what lies ahead in 2019. So let's talk a little bit about Meltdown Inspector. These attacks shocked the industry and users in general because it was a ubiquitous attack. It didn't matter what system you were using. It didn't matter if you were a Windows or an Apple person. You were vulnerable. What have we learned from this? And we're still seeing Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities show up. What can we do?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think just starting out by looking at Spectre and Meltdown and how much attention that the publication of those vulnerabilities gathered is important. Even though we haven't seen any breaches or attacks directly attributed to exploitation of them, these sorts of problems in hardware have been known about for a long time. They've never been curated in this way and demonstrated as being ubiquitous, as you said, until the publication of Spectre and Meltdown. But the idea of these sorts of hardware-driven microarchitectural side-channel cache attacks have been around well over a decade. The first thing that's coming to mind is in 2008 there was a presentation at TorCon Seattle on detecting if you were in a VM or even extracting cryptographic information out of adjacent programs running on the same host due to co-tenancy by timing various elements of how the processor handles certain return instructions. And that same speculative execution problem is really the core of Spectre, where we've now seen so many other variants though published with Spectre, and it's the speculative branch execution stuff. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm really glad that it's finally ringing with people. There's clarity around, we should really, really care about this. And perhaps the delay in that clarity was because it had to be a perfect storm of everyone being on the cloud now or wanting to be, and now having legitimate co-tenancy concerns. Before you maybe weren't so worried about what one program running might be able to get out of another program if it was on your machines, because you figured either the program was malicious from the beginning and could take over the whole machine, or it was my program and it wasn't malicious. But now the idea that there could be a program running within its bounds but extracting information from you because you're sharing the same deployment instance is scary. So I think it's really good that we're starting to recognize that. The hardware level attacks are obviously very, very intriguing too. I think from a security researcher standpoint, from my view, it's really interesting stuff because, like you said, it's there. It doesn't matter what version of software you're running. I mean, there are obviously patches and workarounds for it, but the idea that it's a hardware level vulnerability makes it very fascinating. I think we're going to see more of this. Spectre and Meltdown, I think, were inspired by some other previous works around attacking hardware microarchitectural mechanisms. Rowhammer being I think the obvious example from a couple of years ago, the ability to manipulate data based on how the architecture handled it. And now we're seeing the ability to steal data, even if you can't manipulate it. I think we're going to continue to see this. And where we'll get interesting is where these cache mechanisms are vulnerable even beyond the processor, right? You have the GPU, or think, could the same thing exist on the mechanism that caches data between your keyboard or other peripheral devices? And so I definitely think we're going to see more research in that direction, which it's good that we are ahead of it and already being concerned with Spectre and Meltdown. My fear is the fatigue. Until we've seen a real attack tied to it, people might just get worried that it's just overhyped. But I suspect those attacks are coming.
Well, we've seen attacks, though, where, wireless keyboards have been attacked. There have been driver attacks. There are firmware attacks. Go back years and years and years. I mean, I quite literally remember firmware attacks when I used to work in the deck industry. The old digital equipment machines were being attacked because of firmware errors. So, now, again, they were, because the world was different then, those attacks weren't actually coming from the outside. They were problems that were internal. Okay, but they realized that there were, machines that were giving up data because of, a firmware upgrade. And that's one of the fears that we hear all the time, coming from China and things like that. China will put out a device and then have an upgrade that will have a malicious payload. Is that along the same lines as what we're seeing with Spectre and Meltdown, where something might come out and be safe, and then it gets breached from a firmware upgrade?
I mean, I think that's just as legitimate of a concern, if not even perhaps more legitimate of a concern. Well, in some regards, it really depends how you want to place your concern over these issues. I think it's a more immediately obvious concern if your hardware is being tampered or backdoored coming out of production, out of the factory and into your hands. What's scary about the Spectre Meltdown stuff is that it's not, it wasn't intentional, right? It was, or it was an intentional trade-off for performance reasons to have these caching mechanisms work the way they did, but they introduced security vulnerability. So it's I think the issue you raised of the supply chain attack is so terrifying. I mean, the ability to inspect hardware and understand and attest to its legitimacy is such a daunting issue. I'm lost right now. My memory's not serving me, but there was this article on, these motherboards that were shipped with this little tiny, the size of a grain of rice or smaller chip that was planted to manipulate data coming off the wire, and that is, or I think even look inward towards the CPU and do memory, DMA style manipulation. Speaking of big breaches this year, that sort of thing is what nightmares are made of, and and you're right. We've known this sort of thing was a threat forever. I mean, as you said, firmware has always been a target of interest. It's interesting that those sorts of threats and the risks around them and the concerns are seeing, reality. Things are coming to fruition.
Well, Spectre and Meltdown were huge, but another huge problem, was what the city of Atlanta saw. Ransomware really took its toll this year. Atlanta decided that it didn't want to pay the ransom, and tried to work around it. I believe the ransom was somewhere around $16,000 and Last I
Wow.
heard,
Yeah.
Atlanta had spent something more than 40 million trying to eradicate it. The FBI actually originally used to say, go ahead and pay the ransom if you, if you think you're, if the systems are that important and you just can't afford the downtime. Now they're saying don't pay the ransom. Uh, what do you do? I mean, when even the cops don't know what to do,
Yeah. I mean, that's such a crazy problem too. With everything from WannaCry to Petya to not Petya, it was interesting to watch the public response to that, and even the security industry be conflicted over what they recommended. I remember someone, when ransomware first became a big topic, saying, someone should play the sort of tough love bad guy and put out ransomware that doesn't actually decrypt when you pay it, to incentivize people to not pay ransomware, to further then de-incentivize ransomware. But as not Petya came out and it couldn't actually restore your system after it was paid, it demonstrated that that didn't change, that ransomware will continue to persist as a problem. The other thing I find funny about ransomware is that, the movie Hackers pretty much called this out 20 years ago. As a problem, right? Like, one of the core plot element is this Michelangelo virus that's affecting this shipping company if money is not transferred into an account. And we literally had companies, the Danish company Maersk, or that Chinese company Costco, not to be confused with Costco, but
right.
Their operations were shut down as a result of ransomware. It's almost like reality imitating art. It's fascinating to watch, and like, you obviously can't just say just back up your system. I mean, that is obviously great advice, but it's always been great advice for disaster recovery, let alone for ransomware. So why, and will that become a cat and mouse game? Like, if that's the case, then will ransomware start targeting backup systems specifically?
Well, they already do in some ways, and
right.
the problem there is, before you restore that backup, have you actually checked to make sure that the backup is clean? Because the ransomware may well have been sitting on your system for, 6 months, a year, 2 years. It might not be a new version of ransomware. It may have just been in stealth mode. You put the backup on, and all of a sudden, bam, you get hit again and again and again. I spent a lot of years in the disaster recovery business, and I know that, as good as a backup is it's only as good as the last time you confirmed that there was nothing bad on there, and, you don't even know. You can't even be sure these days.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I guess maybe we're lucky that the sophistication of most of the ransomware we've seen out there, has been targeting money that would seem to imply, the amounts of money that it's requesting would seem to imply that it wasn't so well funded. So perhaps they're not as sophisticated of actors that are writing it for perform that sort of attack. But certainly, if they're already looking at backup mechanisms, sophistication bar is rising there.
Well, it does get crazy. The disaster recovery market doesn't do as good of a job as it could, reminding folks to make sure that they verify the validity of their backups before they restore it.
Oh yeah.
One of the keys. Go ahead.
What is the protocol and process around that? Everyone knows that you're supposed to back up, but it's almost like never discussed. Like, how do you validate your backups? How do you set benchmarks and metrics around what is a good backup, and what should be the correct data that you're restoring?
And GDPR is going to make that even more insane when, does your backup contain information that, that you've deleted because somebody made a request to be forgotten, and all of a sudden you restore the backup, and here's all of this data coming back again. But you no longer have the request to delete it because that was destroyed.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Talk about a Gordian knot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go insane just trying to figure that one out.
Yeah, and that's before even thinking about the implications of the ransomware. That's just in managing your normal backup process.
One of the differences between ransomware and other malware attacks is that, ransomware is basically in your face. There's nothing stealthy about it. Not only do the companies that get hit by such attacks need to deal with the attack themselves, they also get hit with high-profile news coverage. They get attacked in the consumer press. A lot of the tech press understands that this is going to happen. Consumer press doesn't necessarily. That said, the old adage that persistence threats are caused by consumerized malware designed to go after specific companies really hasn't gone away. It doesn't get the news coverage it used to, but were there any game changers in 2018 on how companies deal with APTs? And we've seen significant growth in the intelligence feed software. Is that helping to battle the more mundane APTs?
That's a good question. I mean, I think intelligence feeds are definitely helping for very specific sorts of targets. But the generalized case, I don't know. I've not seen enough positive output of that to confirm that. I think the things that people are doing though to make themselves more resilient to APTs, a lot of it has been in their build and deploy processes, really more than anything. So less about detecting and more about either preventing or constantly moving, right? Like with containerization and deploying, or even serverless sort of infrastructure, where you're not managing a server, you're managing an instance that can go away, and you have many of them for high availability. And if it's immutable infrastructure, so it really makes the APT bring out the advanced part in order to cause you damage or steal your data at this point, because they can't. If it's immutable infrastructure and they can't write to your instance, they have to constantly reinfect or remain memory resident. And companies are thinking about this now as like, we have our services up for high availability and we're measuring things in reverse downtime now. Like how long, it's not how long that container or that server was running. We want to keep it up for weeks, months, years. If we want to keep an instance up for hours and then cycle it back out, how fresh is that instance? And so, treating your infrastructure like that, I think is probably the best approach I've seen in this year and maybe a little bit of last year, seeing people get feedback around. We know that there was an attack happening, but we were able to stay agile and resilient, such that the attacker couldn't get a solid foothold on our environment. And it's interesting to see how intelligence feeds have played around that, though. When they replace these instances, you're able to see what the connections were that were happening at that time, take that data, use that intelligence, and apply it across the other clusters. But I don't know how that relates to the mundane stuff, the endpoint user stuff. I'm not sure that we've seen big advancements there, unless you've heard otherwise. I mean,
no, that's one of the reasons I was asking the question.
Yeah,
because I haven't heard otherwise. We often look at what's the latest and most devastating type of malware that's attacking systems. And we're always trying to figure out what the next 0 day is going to be. But the reality is, a lot of companies really should consider employing Sherman and Peabody's Wayback Machine and look at things that perhaps they haven't patched from the past. This year, we're still seeing companies being hit by viruses, like WannaCry or the 10-year-old Conflicker virus, the 15-year-old Solidity virus. Take a look at the BBC has actually done quite a few stories about companies in the UK that are being hit by DOS-based viruses, which to me, quite frankly, is astounding. AV software is sometimes considered obsolete, but actually, I prefer to use a description offered by a mid-20th century playwright, Eugene Ionesco. He referred to it as a useless precaution, but absolutely necessary. Why do we still need to keep our old AV software installed and updated, aside from, simply meeting compliance and insurance liability requirements?
I mean, that's a very good question. I think the adage you cited there of useless precaution but absolutely necessary is spot on.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have it for compliance, and you have to have it to catch a lot of the commodity malware where the intelligence provided by the AV companies of the very popular, you get this herd intelligence aspect of knowing which macro file is bad or the sort of indicators of compromise that the endpoint software can take advantage of. But it's, at what cost as well. One concern I have in mind when thinking about antivirus is what is the attack surface that it's adding while giving you this coverage for this commodity malware? Like you have a program that has to have privileges to access anything on your computer and has to parse all of the different file formats and think about all of the different things that are going on, which means it has all this broad attack surface. And we've seen this. We've seen attacks against AV software. I know Google Project Zero had published something against Microsoft's built-in AV in Windows and demonstrated how it because it had a JavaScript engine in it and could be so easily attacked and a means of breaking out of sandbox stuff because it would reach in to analyze things is terrifying. So
Mm-hmm.
You have to grant your security tooling the permission to be able to look in, but how do you weigh the risk of what if that is the target of the attack? And yet at the same time, like you said, it's a compliance issue. You have to have it. And you can't trust users to just not click links or receive malicious emails or open them. So it's an interesting thing. I don't know that we have a good enough answer to go away from it, but it's almost hard to justify keeping it.
And if you take it off, the compliance officer is going to pop a cork, as will your head counsel, because of course they don't want to have to tell a judge, well, we took it off because, hey, most of the time it doesn't do anything. On the other hand, that's when you'll get bit by one of these old attacks. It still floats around, I would like to remind our listeners, by the way, that at the end we will try to get to your questions. So please do send them in via the interface. We've talked a lot about what we've seen in the past, but let's look forward a bit. What do you expect to see in 2019?
I think we're going to see a continuation of a lot of the trends that have been rising up. So, we started talking about Spectre and Meltdown. I think we're going to see more. I mean, that's piqued the interest of the research community and the academic community, as well as now malicious actors. So I think we're going to see more hardware, microarchitectural level attacks, perhaps against different vendors, again, perhaps against peripherals or other components. And that almost feels like a broader continuation, like you said, of other firmware attacks in many ways. The interest in hardware coming from what we've seen in IoT attacks, right? Like the IoT world doesn't seem to be getting much better, yet we seem to be adding IP addresses and radios to everything. So I think we're going to see more of that in 2019 for sure. The car hacking thing is obviously an example of the interest surge there that's going on. And as we have more automation, an attack surface tied to that automation, we're going to see attacks against it. The other trend I really think is going to continue is attacking core components used to build software. So this is everything from, we saw with shell shock, right, where Bash is so ubiquitous that it was just a devastating vulnerability. But the same thing is true of Heartbleed, attacking SSL, all the way up to Apache Commons, which I believe was behind the Equifax attack. So, this idea of attacking these core open source components, especially with the proliferation of Linux. I feel like Linux ate the world of infrastructure for the last 8 years, and people really weren't thinking about it. And so now looking back, it's like, oh wow, we've got a lot of stuff that we have no idea how to handle, because you have to treat it differently. It's not the same as put AV on it. The attacks against Linux aren't the same as some macro virus or a drive-by download, right? So and the attacks are targeting common shared open source components. I think we're going to see more of those sorts of attacks. I think the attackers have caught on to that. The bad guys have caught on to that as being a successful means of achieving their goals, and that trend is only going to continue.
Is the cure worse than the disease here? With Linux.
As far as using Linux.
Well, yeah, because we pretty much understand, at least in the Windows world, how to what to expect from attacks. We get them all the time, and we're really bad at defending against them sometimes. But we understand it. With the move to Linux, and a lot of folks saying, well, gee, I'm tired of getting attacked on Windows. Linux is free, so I can save money on operating systems. Yeah, right. Again, is the cure worse than the disease?
I really think it's just a matter of maturity and understanding with it. I think there's plenty of opportunity to have arguably better visibility and control over the deployment. But people I think the lack of visibility is why they don't have that control, and they don't have an understanding of what's going on. I certainly don't think it's anything inherent to Linux, although, it doesn't have the best track record. But it clearly, I think it's proved out because it works. The reason why it's the base for Android and the base for many IoT things, and the server base for so much infrastructure is, I think it's versatility. I just think we as users need to be more mature about how we address it. Like you said, with Windows, we've seen the possibilities. We've had to explore this. I think it comes down to understanding what you have deployed and how that affects you, and making sure you prioritize securing it. Which,
perhaps
like I said, I just think
the consumers. Yeah, perhaps it's the consumers that are moving to Linux that are they don't have the security background to. To figure out how to protect themselves. They just assume, hey, it's safe. It's safe.
Yeah. Well, the same thing I think happened with OS X, for that matter, right? Like we're seeing the uprise in OS 10, Mac OS. Sorry, they've renamed, but there's just an assumption that Mac OS was safer than Windows, when really it was safe in the sense that it was a house in the middle of the desert where no one's going to come to it, but not secure. And now we're seeing people come to that house. We're seeing people attacks against it. We're seeing malware that targets that, as market share has gotten to a point that it's gotten the attention of the people writing the malware. I think that's exactly what happened with Linux being deployed. There was not an understanding of how it could be attacked as much as it sort of ate the world of infrastructure the last 8 years. We're looking back and saying, oh, well, yeah, this is probably a problem. Yeah.
Well, let's get to a couple of the questions from our audience before we get too lost in this. Cybersecurity is a never-ending journey. Do you think that AI will help solve cybersecurity issues?
That's a good question. I think the important place to start with that is augmenting the humans involved. I don't know if you've seen the videos of robots pouring cereal all over the table and missing the bowl entirely, but it really sums up my take. Or like the Boston Dynamics dog flipping on a banana peel, which is comedically enjoyable. If you haven't seen it, you should. But I think the goal should be, for example, letting the human ask better questions by means of AI rather than finding all the answers. And I think in that regard, it definitely will.
Well, yeah, there was that story just this week of the robot at Amazon, I believe, that started attacking workers.
Oh wow!
it was pretty bizarre.
I think that's one of the terrifying things of all this automation, self-driving cars, everything is that it can be weaponized against people too. So it's that's interesting.
Well, for those in our audience that never saw the original movie Westworld, they might be familiar with the current television show on it. But I strongly suggest going and watching the old Westworld. It was great film about robots and AI going wrong. Do you still, there are a lot of breaches that are coming through email, spear phishing attacks and all that. The executive, CEO compromise attacks. What are your recommendations on how to stop that in the coming year?
Oh,
And we are almost out of time, so if you can keep it, unfortunately, short.
I mean, I would say automation to try and spot the discrepancies in those emails that can be the telltale signs. Like that I remember with some of those attacks trying to get the CFO or CEO to wire something, you generally see a different sender versus reply to, but that's not something that you can't train a human. I mean, you can try, but people just don't have time to constantly be checking that. So I think the key is automation for the things like that. They could be indicative of it being out of place or potentially malicious. And I know that's a broad answer, but that's the best I think I can give, given the time given. But it's a tough problem.
Yeah, and it's getting worse as the attackers are getting more sophisticated, doing a better job, and unfortunately, when they steal credentials of real employees, it makes it even tougher. We actually are out of time at this point. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. There's some great questions here. For those of you that did submit questions that we didn't get to, all of your questions will be turned over to Brandon and his team. They will be able to get back to you after the event. We could talk about this for hours and hours, but unfortunately, we just don't have that. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Look forward to discussing this with you again in the future, Brandon, anytime. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you all for signing in today to a look back at attacks, the worst vulnerabilities and breaches in 2018 and what lies ahead. So good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you might be. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Stephen.